Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Streets of Hope on Guns and Grace, the theme for the University of Richmond Founders Week, 1998. For several years, the University of Richmond has celebrated Founders Week by affirming its heritage as an institution free of sectarian bias, in a covenant relationship with the Baptist of Virginia, committed to excellence in liberal education in an atmosphere of moral and spiritual concern. The university strives to be a caring and purposeful community that honors the freedom of conscience, promotes an ethic of service, and pursues an education of the whole person. To that end, Founders Week has become an integral part of the educational journey for us at the University of Richmond. Workshops have always been an important part of Founders Week at Richmond. 4 workshops are being offered on 2 separate but related topics. 2 of the workshops focus on families for peace and justice, learning about conflict resolution within the family. 2 focus on the web of violence, looking at behaviors which promote violence at all levels of society. If you are interested in participating in one of the 2 workshops tomorrow afternoon, you may sign up at the front door of the chapel at the conclusion of this program. Streets of Hope on Guns and Grace. To regulate or not to regulate. To ban handguns and assault weapons or not to ban. These are the pressing questions with which we must come to grips. To ignore these questions or to live as if our personal rights are more important than the wholesale loss of human life in this country is to live in denial of what has become a crisis of epidemic proportions. Guns are the second most deadly consumer product after cars on the market. The number of Americans who have died from handguns now exceeds the number of Americans killed in war. In Texas and Louisiana, the firearms-related death rate already exceeds that for motor vehicles. It would seem that gun violence is not only a crime issue, but a public health issue as well. Before the keynote address by Senator Marsh, give attention, please, to the 944 pairs of socks in the chapel tonight. Each pair representing one of the 944 children, teenagers, or adults killed in Virginia by handguns in 1995. The 140 candles at the altar tonight represent the lives that have been lost by homicide in Richmond City during 1997. In memory now of the victims of gun violence in the state of Virginia, I invite you to a moment of silence and reflection. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is my distinct privilege to introduce the Honorable Henry L. Marsh III. He is an honors graduate of Maggie L. Walker High School and Virginia Union University and earned his law degree at Howard University. He began his legal career in 1961 with the firm of Hill, Tucker, and Marsh, joining the fight against the policy of massive resistance, which was brought about as a result of the Brown versus Board of Education case. a nationally prominent civil rights litigator who has argued major cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. Mr. Marsh continues to maintain an active law practice as partner in his law firm with an emphasis in personal injury and criminal defense law. Henry Marsh served on the Richmond City Council from 1966 to 1991. The respect he earned from his colleagues and the public was demonstrated by his election as vice mayor in 1970, and in 1977 by his election as Richmond's first black mayor. Henry Marsh has served the city, states, and nation as a leader in government and civic affairs. He was a co-founder of Project One and the Metropolitan Economic Development Council, which have helped to bring scores of new businesses and thousands of jobs to Central Virginia. He was founder of Blacks Mobilized Against Crime, which has helped to raise community awareness of crime prevention. He has served as president of the National Black Caucus of Local Elected Officials and as a member of the board of directors of the National League of Cities. In 1991, Henry Marsh won the Democratic nomination for the newly created 16th Senate District, gaining a wide margin over 4 strong competitions. He was re-elected to serve a second term in the Virginia State Senate in 1995. He is married to Mrs. Diane Harris Marsh, and they have 3 children, 2 of whom are graduates of the University of Richmond: Nadine Marsh Carter, who received the Bachelor of the Arts in 1986 in T.C. Williams School of Law in 1994, and Sonia Marsh Craft, who received the Bachelor of Science degree in 1988, and they have 2 grandsons. Following Mr. Marsh's address, we are honored to have Delegate Viola Baskerville of the Virginia General Assembly. Would you stand, please? The Reverend Ben Campbell, Executive Director of Richmond Hill, and Professor Joan Neff, U of R Associate Professor of Sociology, to serve as panel respondents. Without further ado, I now present to you the David and Terry Howman Sylvester Keynote Speaker for Founders Week 1998, Senator Marsh.
Good evening. First, I'd like to thank Terrence for that introduction. Viola knows that next year is an election year, and I'm going to come get you, Terrence, when I'm up for re-election. I'd like to congratulate the Spiders on a tremendous weekend of activity. I was so proud of that wonderful performance. Not only did you become CAA champions, but by earning a spot in the NCAAs, you have once again put the city of Richmond in the national limelight and brought the city thousands of dollars worth of goodwill and publicity, which will help the city in its efforts to promote visitors. And the skill and courage the team displayed and the support given by the staff and faculty led to a splendid victory, and I think you ought to give yourselves another hand for that. I feel right at home here at the University of Richmond. Some of you know that both of my daughters matriculated and graduated from the University of Richmond. In fact, my oldest daughter also earned a law degree from T.C. Williams. And my youngest daughter got her husband from the Spider football team when the two of them were students here together. And they made me a grandparent twice. So I'm really feel very comfortable being here. As a matter of fact, I gave my youngest daughter away in this very chapel. The wedding was held right here. And there was an incident that occurred that I'll never forget. We were standing around getting ready to perform the wedding, and the minister said, "Where's the marriage license?" And it turned out that the marriage license had been left at home. And he said, "Well, I'm not going to perform the ceremony unless I have a marriage license. I can't do that." So we live in the east end of Richmond, which normally is about 35 minutes away from here. But I jumped in my car, and I don't know how I did it, but in 20 minutes I had gone and picked up the marriage license and was back here. And I didn't get a ticket, but the wedding proceeded, and it made the wedding even more unforgettable. But you know, my relationship with the University of Richmond began several years earlier when, as a promising young councilman, I was invited to attend the campus and address the Board of Trustees of this university. I see a couple of trustees here tonight. And it was the late 60s. And at that time, the university didn't have hardly any African-American students. And so I came up that evening, and if you're not familiar with this campus, it's hard to know which building you're going to and what building is what in the dark. So I approached a bunch of students to inquire which building was the building where the trustees was meeting. And as I got within 10 or 15 feet of the students, they moved the other way. And after that happened 2 or 3 times, it dawned on me that they might be afraid of me. And so it took a while before I found about 8 or 10 young men who were courageous enough to talk to me and tell me where I wanted to go. So when I got to the trustees meeting, I shared that experience with them. I said, you know, a funny thing happened to me on the way to this meeting. And I told them what happened, and of course they were embarrassed. But I did that to let them know that, you know, they had a problem on the campus. Because I was a councilman, I wasn't going to hurt anybody. And they needed more diversity here at the university. So the way history worked out, as I said, both of my daughters attended here. There were lots of African-American students at the time, and the success that the football team and the basketball team and some of the scholars have had at the university would not have been the same without the African-American students. So we have made progress here. As a matter of fact, later, as mayor, I befriended the university because their status in the NCAA was threatened because they didn't have a stadium, first-class stadium big enough to attract enough people. And I recognized the value of the university to the city, and this was long before my daughters even thought about coming here. And I encouraged my colleagues on city council to donate then City Stadium to the university for the sum of $1. The university had to make the repairs and the upkeep, but they got a stadium, a pretty good stadium, for $1. And that helped the football program, it helped the university. And it paid off for the city because the University of Richmond is a very valuable resource for the city in many, many ways. So obviously I feel very comfortable being here at the university and in this very chapel. And I'm honored that you've asked me to be your Founders Day speaker. And I noticed that you've had some outstanding speakers in the past, including Julian Bond, who was a personal friend, who was recently selected as the new chairman of the National NAACP. And I predict that Julian is going to do an outstanding job to help that organization on its recovery. Now, Terrence indicated that I've had 32 years of elected service. And during that entire time, I've been exposed to an awful lot of violence. And your subject, Guns and Grace, is most appropriate and very valuable. As councilman and as mayor, I've had the honor or the opportunity to attend many, many funerals of crime victims, some of whom I knew and some of whom I didn't know. And it was always a moving experience to share the grief of the family members and friends of someone who had been murdered by someone else. The real tragedy of violence, however, is not just measured by the homicides. Those candles and those socks represent loss of life in Richmond for 1 year and in the state. But the real impact of violence goes far beyond persons who actually kill. Their violence is manifested in all kinds of attacks, short of murder, and the real cost and tragedy and suffering is almost immeasurable. So I think it's appropriate that we focus on your subject, and although not all violence is caused by firearms or handguns, a considerable portion of it is. When I was coming along as a preteen, which was really just a few years ago, it wasn't that long ago, I was raised in a rural area of Virginia in Isle of Wight County. And like most preteens, we used to get in our share of arguments and disagreements, and sometimes those disagreements resulted in fights. We had fist fights, and occasionally, if it really escalated, someone would grab a stick and hit someone with a stick. And that was the extent of the violence when I was coming along. Once, every now and then, in a rare situation, someone might take a knife and cut someone, but that was unusual. But to shoot someone with a gun was unheard of. Now, if you stop at the scene of an accident and ask the other driver something that he interprets as a smart remark, he may pull out a piece and try to blow you away. Something is wrong. And let's examine some of the facts about firearms, because sometimes firearms are so pervasive in America that we forget the price we pay for the all too easy access to guns. I'm going to give you some numbers, and I'll ask you to bear with me because numbers are boring, but these numbers are shocking. There are 192 million privately owned firearms in the United States, 65 million of which are handguns. In 1995, 15,835 people at 1 year were murdered with firearms in this country alone. In 1996, firearms were used in 7 out of 10 murders committed in the United States, and handguns were used in 59% of the murders. In 1996, 8 out of 10 of those murdered with firearms were murdered with handguns. And finally, in 1996, there were only, of the 15,000 people murdered, because people say that we need guns for self-defense, of the 15,800 people murdered, only 176 justifiable handgun homicides by private citizens took place. So you see, it's not about self-defense. It's about an awful lot of murders. Well, people say, well, you know, you need a handgun to protect your home. You got to protect your home. Let's look at that. Guns kept in the home for self-protection are 43 times more likely to kill a family member or a friend than to kill in self-defense. The presence of guns or a gun in the home triples the risk of homicide in the home. And the presence of a gun in the home increases the risk of suicide 5-fold. Well, it's suggested that guns are a blight on our young people. For instance, the facts show that in 1994, firearms was the #2 killer of men and women aged 10 to 24 years of age, second only to motor vehicle crashes. In 1994, the firearm injury death rate among males 15 to 24 years of age was 32% higher than the motor vehicle traffic injury death rate. And in 1994, firearm homicide was the leading cause of death for black males ages 15 to 34. And finally, in 1995, 14 children ages 19 and under were killed with guns every day in this country. Surprised? You shouldn't be, because, and Kat gave you some statistics, but she didn't quite have it straight, because in 1995 alone, that 1 year, 37,957 Americans were killed with firearms in homicides, suicides, and accidents. In that 1 year alone, whereas 33,651 Americans were killed during the entire Korean War. So more people killed in that 1 year alone than in the entire period of the Korean War. And 58,148 people were killed in the bloodiest war, the Vietnam War, during the whole years of the war, as opposed to 36,000 people roughly killed in 1995 alone. And licensed firearm dealers who are helping to fuel this gun surge sell 7.5 million guns every year, of which 3.5 million are handguns. And of all accident fatalities involving firearms, 71% involve handguns. Now let me give you one more statistic. And in my mind, this may be the most shocking set of statistics of all. And listen at these figures. In 1996, handguns were used to murder 2 people in New Zealand, 15 people in Japan, 30 people in Great Britain, 106 people in Canada, 211 people in Germany, but 9,390 people in the United States. That 1 year, 2 people, 15 people, 30 people, 106 people, 211 people, in the United States, 9,390 people. Something is wrong. Something is wrong. Viola was sharing with me a victory we had in the legislature today. A bill had passed the Senate reversing a decision we made a few years ago, which permitted people with concealed weapons to carry those weapons in restaurants and bars where people were eating. And this year, a bill was passed out of the Senate which said it's all right to do that. We couldn't stop it. But in a House committee today, the bill was passed by indefinitely, which is a way of saying it was killed for this session. But to think that the gun lobbyists are so brazen that they would try to get the right to carry a handgun in a restaurant where people are trying to eat. It was opposed by the restaurant industry, but it almost became law again. And that's part of a pattern. Last year, they killed a bill on the House floor that I'd gotten out of the Senate to ban handguns in public parks. And within an hour of the time that bill was killed, a young man was murdered by a handgun in Richmond Park. And last year, a bill was killed that would have prevented people from carrying guns in the Fairfax County Police Station. I've been in that station because that's where the court building is for court cases. It's a very crowded place. And the NRA opposed that bill on the grounds that, well, they have metal detectors, so you don't need a law. And the majority of the legislature bought that, and the law did not pass. We killed bills this year which would have prevented handguns from being carried in a recreation center in Fairfax County, where gang activity is flourishing. And there was testimony from police officers that groups of teenagers are in the rec center packing iron, and the police can't do anything about it because there's no law against it. But the legislature, because the NRA objected, would not pass that law. Now, there's a theory going around that gun legislation doesn't help. There's a tired old myth floating around that common sense gun laws are a burden on law-abiding citizens. Another one of these myths, a variation of the same theme, is that gun laws only take the guns away from citizens, law-abiding citizens, not the criminal. And these two myths help to frustrate our efforts to get meaningful gun control legislation. But there's a Center to Prevent Handgun Violence that's done some research. And I'll just give you 4 examples. Maryland, the state of Maryland in 1994 banned the sale of assault pistols and high-capacity magazines. And the Center for Handgun Violence to Prevent Violence discovered that after the ban, 55% fewer high-powered assault handguns were seized at crime scenes. The Brady Law, which was passed in 1994, has blocked the sale of over 250,000 prohibited users. In other words, because of the passage of the Brady Law, the law enforcement had a chance to check some of the people getting weapons before they got them, and 47,000 of these people who've been kept from getting weapons have turned out to be convicted felons. So the law has worked. And gun licensing is something that's coming about, and every state requires a citizen to have a driver's license. On the theory that an automobile is dangerous, why not require people to have a license to possess a gun? And since in the last few years, the statistics have shown that the number of crimes committed by people with guns has started down. And we suggest that reasonable gun regulation would make this drop even further. Now, I just want to deal with a myth that we hear all the time about the Second Amendment. It's a violation of somebody's constitutional right to carry a gun. The Second Amendment says a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. But they always leave out that part about the militia. They take the last phrase and say the Constitution says the right of people to bear arms shall not be infringed. And the Second Amendment guarantees the people the right to be armed only in connection with the service in a well-regulated militia. And they're not talking about these gangs around here with guns either when they talk about well-regulated militia. And courts have consistently ruled that there's no constitutional right to own a gun for private purposes unless it's connected with the state militia. But that's what we hear. The obvious purpose of the Second Amendment was to assure the continuation and render the possible effectiveness of state militia forces. And there's a whole lot of other information on that. But that's one of the arguments that the NRA has used to get people fired up. I'm going to save some information for the panel to discuss, but let me share with you 2 other concerns. In the years that I've been involved in public service, one of the things that has now developed is a growing appreciation for the rights of victims of crime. There was a time when the victims' rights were ignored, and now there's a fund created to help provide modest amounts of money for victims. There's a right for victims to participate in the court process, in the sentencing process, to participate in the criminal process, and a right to be heard. And there's a growing awareness that victims have rights too. And we're moving in a direction of providing some kind of compensation for victims so that when they lose a loved one, a family member, they won't have to also have a tragic economic loss of a breadwinner with no compensation. That's a very positive development, and I would urge you to continue to support such a development. The other thing is that there's a strong correlation, and I was talking to someone at dinner tonight, between the lack of effective education and a life of crime. And some of the deterioration in family environment and an increase in crime. And the headlines in the paper a few days ago pointed out that a group had studied the Kerner Commission report, and on the 30th anniversary of the Kerner Commission report, they indicated that the conditions predicted by the Kerner Commission 30 years ago had been realized, that the gap between white and black had gotten wider, that twice as many people earning less than $15,000 a year exist now than existed 30 years ago. And although there was some suggestion that the number of blacks earning $70,000 a year had increased, therefore the Kerner Commission was wrong. But Mr. Woodson, who made that comment, missed the point of the Kerner Commission. The Kerner Commission predicted a growing alienation by certain people in our society, and that alienation is growing more rapidly. And in the midst of a growing affluence, it becomes even more dangerous. There are two Americas, and many of the people who live in one America has no idea of what's going on in the other America, and that has something to do with the escalation in violence. There was a time when suburbanites could be smug, saying that that's an inner city problem. But if you've noticed the headlines within the last couple of years, you've seen more and more examples that the problem has been exported to the suburbs. It's a community problem. So we are really challenged. We're really challenged by this attitude, this atmosphere that perpetuates and encourages violence. And it would be a disservice to suggest to you that it's a simple answer with a simple solution that would be solved if we passed gun laws or laws to limit guns. It's not that simple, although I suggest that the prevalence of guns is a major part of the problem. It's much more complicated than that. And part of the answer lies in understanding the message of the Kerner Commission report and understanding that education is the leavener that causes all people to have an opportunity to rise. That government can do much more than government is doing, but the real answer is not in more government. The real answer is in the people, all people, understanding what we're facing and getting involved. The religious community, the education community, and even persons who are deprived of educational opportunities. Everyone has a responsibility to address this problem. That's why this forum tonight is so important, and I'm so glad you gave me a chance to participate and share in it. I've always known that violence and violence by handguns was a dangerous thing. And in my early years, I debated, when I started off debating the NRA people, I was warned that you can't do that. Those people are dangerous. If you do that, they might do something to you. And I said, you got to be kidding. I said, they don't want to make a martyr out of me. I went on WRVA and debated the NRA spokesperson about handguns back in the 60s. And when I got in the legislature and became chairman of the subcommittee on crime, all the criminal laws, the gun laws have to come through my committee. I'm still debating the NRA. He comes to every meeting, he sits right there, and I'm very civil and polite to him, and he wins almost all the battles. I'll get a few out of the committee, or a few of them through the floor, but they'll catch him over in the house. But we're still battling. And what needs to happen is that more citizens need to make their voices heard. Polls show that the great majority of Americans support effective gun control legislation. But you sit back and permit a well-organized lobby that writes letters and that come to meetings, dominate the legislature in the state and in the nation. It's time that citizens who care about this country speak out and come to meetings and make your voices heard. Recently, I personally had an experience with violence. All those things that Terrence said about me, things that I had achieved, were not things that I had done personally. I was the point person, the one out front, but the main person supporting me was my closest friend, my brother, who worked with me and encouraged me and advised me and gave me advice and did things so that I could participate in public service. And while I was in court in Maryland, fighting for the rights of an African-American girl who had been falsely imprisoned in King's Dominion for something that someone else did. And by the way, we won the case, and she got some money, and it turned out well, but I got a phone call that my brother had been shot with a handgun, shot down in the streets of Richmond. And so I learned, again, firsthand, how tragedy can affect you. And since the trial is Wednesday, I can't say any more about that tonight, but I can assure you that it was a reminder to me of how painful violence can be in the lives of people. And so I'm doubly committed to continue to fight. And that guy can come to my meeting as much as he wants to, and I'm going to keep battling him as long as he comes. But I sure would like to see a whole lot more people there speaking out. Most politicians aren't that courageous. And if they see a mass of people, they'll change their minds about gun control. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Marsh, for your address. Will the panel respondents please take their places?
Good evening. Good evening. It's good to be back on the campus again. I was on the campus Saturday and have been on University of Richmond's campus many times. In fact, I think I was here at a Founders Day speech a few years ago. As Senator Marsh was making his remarks, I looked at the candles and thought what a moving expression. I remember my first induction to homicide in the streets of Richmond when I first went on city council, and that was an all-night ride-along with the Richmond City Police. And on that particular evening, between 9 p.m. and 5 a.m., there were 3 murders in the city of Richmond. And I had never been to a murder scene before, but the carnage that was there, that was on the street, and the numbness of the individuals standing around watching, and woman silently over in the corner, muffling, having her cries muffled, was a very traumatic experience. And then 18 months after that, to have a first cousin killed on the streets of Richmond within my district from a robbery attempt. Makes all of these things, even as a legislative person, very personal to you, and so issues take on a different arena and different aura, different cause. I'm going to go ahead and let Dr. Neff and Reverend Campbell make their remarks, and then I would like to come back later and sort of wrap it up by posing some questions to the audience or to the panel members specifically, and to highlight some of the issues that Senator Marsh raised in his remarks. But just briefly before we do that, when we looked at a brief tally of some of the murder victims in the city of Richmond during the year 1997, early on, around about September, we saw about 125 victims, I believe. 75 of those just had a high school education, and this underscores the point that the senator made about education. And then a lot of those victims were unemployed, and so we see the factors of education and unemployment standing prominent even in the lives of the victims. So that tells us something about this whole complicated issue. It's more than just the guns. It's a whole sociological, economic issue. So I would like to turn the mic over to Dr. Neff and let her make her comments.
Good evening. Senator Marsh has shared a lot of information with us, a lot of very good information, helpful information in terms of understanding the scope of this problem. And I'd like to start off by sharing a few more pieces of information that I gathered in terms of preparing for tonight. As probably many people know, one of the major issues that's been on the minds of the public recently has been the increasing violence on the part of juveniles in the United States. And I teach a course in juvenile delinquency. I've been doing research on juvenile delinquency for many years. I'm currently involved in a research project looking at juvenile violence in Virginia. And the homicide rate among juveniles in this country peaked a couple of years ago in 1994. And most of the increase that occurred was a trend that began in the early 1980s. Most of the increase was due to males, and all of the increase was firearm related. Fortunately, as Senator Marsh mentioned, we've seen a slight downturn in those statistics in 1995 and 96, and hopefully into 1997, although the final figures aren't out yet. And one of the studies I was looking at suggests that it's not that the juveniles who are committing violence are doing more violence because most juveniles only commit a single act of violence. What seems to be happening is that more juveniles are committing violence than ever before. And instead of a small number of chronic offenders who are involved in serious crime, the number of chronic offenders involved in violent crimes also seems to be increasing slightly. It used to be that criminologists would say that about 15% of juveniles committed 60% of all serious crimes, and now that number is increasing, or that percentage is increasing to 17 or 18%. So it seems as if more of our juvenile population are becoming involved in violence than ever before. Another study that I looked at recently examined juveniles who were arrested in 7 different sites across the country, and these were all male juveniles. And they found that 20% of these young people said that they carried a firearm all of the time or most of the time, everywhere they went. They were constantly armed. A third of them said that they had used a firearm in a crime. We're talking about juveniles, people under the age of 18. And when asked why they carried a firearm, most of them said it was for protection or self-defense, that they felt they needed it. But another really telling statistic, I think, is that 18% also said that they thought it was okay to shoot someone who disrespected them. So as Senator Marsh was saying, someone who makes a remark that you don't like, it's okay to go ahead and shoot them in retaliation for that. And some of our young people firmly believe that. The other thing, though, that I wanted to make sure we pointed out, and again, in response to Senator Marsh's remarks about forgetting sometimes about the victims of crime, juveniles also are frequently victims of violence in this country. And we sometimes think, when we think of crime victims, we tend to think of adults and particularly elderly people sometimes. But in 1994, the rate of violent victimization of juveniles was 3 times the rate of adult victimization. So juveniles were 3 times as likely to be victimized as adults violently. One of the things that, of course, as a sociologist and criminologist that I often get asked is, well, what are the causes? What can we do? How can we solve this problem? And I have no ready-made answers either. I think we have to look at the education system. We have to look at our society as a whole and some of the tremendous differences we have in terms of socioeconomics. And I also read the report on the Kerner Commission and have sort of known that that was coming all along by watching statistics in the 80s particularly. But in terms of another issue I wanted to raise, and a factor that a lot of us look at in terms of juvenile crime and violence, the family, I think, is an important area that needs to be emphasized. And I think, of course, many people are quick to blame the family these days for all of society's ills. And that's unfortunate, but I do think that the family deserves some of that blame. And let me tell you why. One of the factors that we're currently looking at in terms of promoting delinquency, and particularly violent delinquency, is the role of child maltreatment. And child maltreatment is a broad term, and it encompasses not only abuse in terms of physical, sexual, or emotional, but also neglect. And just again, a couple of statistics. Between 1986 and 1993, at the same time that juvenile violent crime was skyrocketing, so were the number of cases of child maltreatment. During that time period, the number of cases doubled. Was that a coincidence? 78% of the cases of maltreatment were at the hands of the child's birth parents. So while we worry about our children being abused potentially by strangers or teachers or daycare workers, very often our children are abused and neglected by their own parents. And while some children may be learning violence from television or video games or friends in school or on the streets, the fact remains that many, if not most of them, are also learning it at home. Parents model violence to their children, and from day one, parents are the most important role models that children have. Children who are hit, shaken, kicked, punched, beaten, learn that this is how you get people to do what you want them to do. So I would suggest that while we certainly need to do many, many things in terms of curtailing violence in our society and removing handguns from people's hands who are going to misuse them is certainly an important part of that. We also need to broaden our efforts, I think, to look at violence in general and to look at how we as a society promote it, not just in terms of TV, as I mentioned, or in terms of video games or all of those other problematic areas, but also what's going on in our own homes. And we need to model nonviolence for our children if we expect them to treat others that way.
Puzzle a lot about the inability to deal with issues of handgun control and assault weapon control in an urban area. It's been very interesting watching the Virginia General Assembly. Senator Marsh put into the General Assembly a request on behalf of the Richmond City Council to permit Richmond City alone to regulate guns. This was a proposal approved by the Richmond City Council, by its legislative delegations, by a majority of its citizens, and those honorable men and women in the General Assembly who believe in self-government and freedom of choice when it comes to the city of Richmond apparently don't think we should have it. They felt that it was such an important mission to make sure that our children were armed that we should not regulate guns even in the city of Richmond. Now that strikes me as very irrational because I've heard lots of speeches from those same legislators about how important it is for folks to have freedom in their own areas. And I think it represents the fact that we're really dealing with something deeply irrational here in our inability to deal with guns. It really doesn't make any sense to sell something to someone called a street sweeper. That's an anti-personnel weapon, I would say, wouldn't you? And if you're in certain parts of Richmond on New Year's Eve, you hear, well, they aren't firecrackers, those 30 rounds that go off at a time. I think I've heard as many as 100 guns on a given night on a time of celebration. I guess I'm glad they're shooting their ammunition at that time, and not some other. So there's a great irrationality here. And I'm glad Henry Marsh came back because I wanted to start what I said by saying he's one of my heroes. And there is something very special about Henry and Harold and their relationship and their gift to this city. And in the kingdom of heaven, people know the truth about what's been done and the sacrifices that have been made. And we're all very grateful and inspired by the gift that's come from both of them. I was out in one of our two major suburban counties not long ago. I was asked to go speak to a group of clergy at a church. They were Baptist, I know you'll be pleased to know. And it was in the 11,000 block of one of our major east-west streets. Y'all can count 11,000. That's a long way out there, right? We didn't go to 11,000 until a few years ago. And I got to this church. It was a very large church surrounded by lots and lots of parking lots. And I mean, to tell you, I walked around that church for 15 minutes trying to find a way to get into it. I don't know what those people were afraid of out there. Now, I've been in Jackson Ward, and I've been in Churchill, and I've been in Southside, and I've been in the Fan, and I've been in what we call the West End. And, you know, I found churches open all over the place and secretaries sitting inside and talking to you. Easy to get in, you know, in those dangerous areas that I live in, but way out there in the 11,000 block, those people were scared to death of something. And that's not very rational either. I mean, there's a lot of fear out there. We just have to identify what's going on here. So I asked the clergy when I finally got inside, what's going on out here? And they said, well, you know, we're scared. And I said, yeah, I guess you really are. I think this is about civilization, friends. It's about whether or not we can, in fact, see ourselves as moving toward a society which is disarmed, where police are the primary people who carry weapons and where we don't have to be quite as afraid of each other, or whether we're going to move in the opposite direction. And frankly, it feels to me right now like a majority of this country feels like the society is going to disintegrate and they have to be armed when it does. And that is really, that's the feeling I have, and that too is irrational. So I guess just on my own behalf and the behalf of the folks who live in the other part of America, I'd like to ask that you don't abandon us, that you let us find a way of civilizing our area, even if folks need to be afraid out there in the 11,000 block. We need to find a way to have civilization in our own part of town. And I ask that folks find a way to help us participate again in the economic system in America so that our children are not trapped in lives of poverty and thrown in to such an impacted situation that violence becomes more likely rather than less likely. I mean, it really has to do with concentrations of hopeless people and people who really can't do much else and feel trapped. I ask you to help us find a way of redressing what's been done to the city of Richmond since 1970, which is that we have become completely isolated economically due to an action of the General Assembly which prohibited us from either annexing or from reaping benefits from the economic growth of metropolitan Richmond. I ask you to help us fight against the kind of implicit race and class warfare that's represented in this crazy refusal to pay attention to gun control. I ask you to help us have transportation for our young people to jobs, help us have equal financing for our public schools so that we have at least as good a chance as people who live in other parts of the metropolitan city. We're in a situation right now where it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out why it's getting harder for us to prevent violence in some of our neighborhoods. It really doesn't take a whole lot to figure it out. If you'll come spend a day with me, I'll be glad to show you why. And I'll be glad to show you the legislation on the books and the state subsidies to transportation to the farthest realms of the metropolitan area. In the last 25 years, the County of Henrico has received $1 billion from the federal and state governments to build major highways. And Chesterfield County last week turned down an offer by the state government to pay for one bus line which poor people could ride to jobs. I mean, it really does not take a lot to figure this out. And our children are pushed to situations which are just extremely violent. Well, we really do need your help, and we need the help of fair-minded people everywhere, not just to deal with gun control issues, which God knows I would like to deal with, but to deal with the things that make guns and violence so close at hand and make people so desperate that that seems to be the way to go.
Thank you. I would just like to make a few comments sort of highlighting some of the action on the House side of the General Assembly this session so far. we've had no fewer than 6, there are probably about 10 total House bills introduced that had to do some way in curtailing firearms, whether they were part of the package, the legislative package of the city of Richmond, or whether they came from delegates in other cities, particularly Norfolk and Northern Virginia urban areas who are contending with the same types of issues that we are in the city of Richmond, have asked for locally, for the locality to control gun legislation and gun laws. Many of them had to do with restricting firearms in certain places. Some of them had to do even with redefining firearms. One of the comments that was made tonight, well, do we really need Uzis and street sweepers? No, we don't. And then one today, which was the Senate bill that was heard in the Militia and Police House Committee that wanted a person with a concealed weapons permit to be allowed to carry a gun into a restaurant, and the argument being advanced by the proponents of the bill was that law-abiding citizens should have the right to protect themselves. Well, our questions to those people supporting that bill was, you have a privilege through a permit to carry a concealed weapon, but do you need to bring a concealed weapon into a place in which people ostensibly come to have a meal where alcohol is served, and once alcohol and a potentially loaded weapon are mixed, there is an opportunity for an episode to escalate into violence, so that almost one of the short outcomes is that of death and carnage and murder. And we had a very difficult time making sure that our votes held together so that people would be definitely convinced that no, this bill should not be passed. But we prevailed. It did not get out of committee. Therefore, it will not go on to the full floor of the House for debate. But it was interesting, Senator Marsh mentioned about that oil machinery that's there. That individual from the NRA was there. There were individuals that said support Senate Bill 342 there, but also there were people who were victims of, or had family members who were victims of gunshot. There were people from the hospitality associations. There were people from hotel and restaurants associations who said, no, we believe alcohol and firearms do not mix, and we do not agree with this particular bill. I also want to talk more about the attitudes of many of the proponents of legislation to expand what they call their right to bear arms. And I would like to put out a question now for individuals on the panel to be thinking about whether this privilege to have a concealed weapon has somehow escalated in an interpreted automatic right, that individuals take that 60-second or that 30-second sound bite and they elevate that and turn up the volume so that's all people hear, as the senator say, the right to bear arms. And is that right more important, that individual right, quote unquote, more important than the existence, the right to liberty and life that the rest of us have? I remember a statement from sort of Star Trek and the Mr. Spock, where the good of the many outweigh that of the few, and I sort of wonder where we're heading with this particular right. We also sensed in these committee meetings and presentations for those individuals that were proponents of the right to bear arms, that there's almost this sense of fear that I have to, quote, protect myself, and I have to carry this gun from my car into the restaurant and somehow have protection between the car and the door. There used to be an attitude in the Wild Wild West that even at the saloon you checked your guns in with the barkeeper and you didn't have the guns in there while you were eating or drinking. And I wonder if the population of victims of gunshots were racially different, meaning there were more people who were non-minorities that were killed. Would that make a difference? Would we see a different sort of attitude behind that? And so these are questions that we put on the table as well, because there are no easy answers to this very complex, almost escalating violence. And we see that not only in the handgun and in the weapons that is used, but we see that in the language that is on television. We see that most recently we had a resolution in the House protesting the gangster rap. We see violence in child abuse, neglect. We see increasingly these horror stories coming to our front page newspapers, and these are real horror stories, whether we are in urban areas or we are in rural, secluded areas where children are raped by people they know, whether it's a relative or a parent or whatever, and abused and thrown away as if their lives have nothing. So in this whole piece of the handgun debate, there is definitely a larger piece to talk about just violence in our society today. And so I would like to now ask those individuals who would like to have questions to give to any of the panel members here or to Senator Marsh. There is a microphone in the center aisle, and if you would just line up as you would like to have your question answered, I would be glad to recognize you. Are there any questions? Don't be shy.
Well, I'll start because people always hate to start. I have a question about the responsibility of the media in this whole game of life, in that I don't see this kind of discussion going on in our newspapers, and I don't see this kind of discussion going on at the level that might inform people. These kind of statistics only come about at this kind of event. And I'm wondering how we as citizens can come about to raise the stakes a bit so that newspapers feel that it's their obligation to talk about these things.
That's an excellent question. Who on the panel or Senator Marsh would like to address that? Either one? Anyone? Reverend Ben.
I have an anecdote told me by a prosecutor who said that at one point he had taken under, had as a goal interviewing a series of persons who had committed felony murder as to what they were doing the 24 hours before they had committed their crime. And he said that it was really amazing the number of persons who had been watching some form of violent show on television or video in the 24 hours before they'd done it. I have nothing to say except that's an anecdote. One of the great, we are really in a crisis of our civilization. Responsibility and media are not words that normally should occur in the same sentence. We have established a principle of freedom of speech whereby we indoctrinate every child in this society for 6 or 8 hours a day before they go to school and after they are in school with messages which no one screens for content. Now, you wouldn't do that in a classroom, and you wouldn't do it in your normal dealings with your children, but that's precisely what happens. These are commercially motivated messages. They have no necessary relationship to anything that would be beneficial. In fact, many of them are not. And I don't really quite know where to go with our media right now. I think you have to really train parents not to let their kids watch television.
Senator.
I think to a certain extent, the press might have a responsibility to report the news in such a way as not to glamorize violence. But I think it would be a mistake for us to deflect responsibility to the press for what is occurring. This week is Reading is Fundamental Week, and I hope that each person here will volunteer an hour this week to read to some children in the classroom. When parents don't read to children and adults don't introduce children to the world of books, you create a void which makes the child susceptible to television and movies and videos and etc. And we built, when I was in local government, we built a series of libraries around the city in areas where we hope would encourage people to take their kids to the library. And they were underutilized despite programs designed to bring them to the library. And I say the problem is very complicated. If there's a void, something is going to fill it. And we need to get back to the practice of having parents and siblings read to young children so they can find out what is out there in the world of books. And with the new television technology, if they start off reading books, they might not switch to the porno channel. They might switch to the channel with some of the other educational advantages. It's extremely complicated. There's no easy solution. And I think the responsibility is not pointing this way, but these three fingers coming back this way. I mean, the press might have some responsibility, but I think the responsibility is ours to encourage our children to know what is out there in the world.
Thank you, Senator. Is there another response? No?
Well, I guess the way I understood the question was in terms of whether the media has a responsibility to make the information that a lot of us have been talking about public, and I think they do, actually. I think if you watch the local news and national news and read the newspapers, you'll see very often they have feature stories dealing with some of these same issues in which they present lots of facts and figures. I think some of the problem is that as public, we tend to perhaps not read the newspaper as closely as we might, or we skim the headlines, or we read the comics or the horoscopes or something like that. And I think that if the other thing you have to do is make a distinction between the news part of the newspaper and the editorial part of the newspaper. And they're very, very different. You know, I mean, pick up any newspaper. If you want information, I think a lot of the feature articles and the stories that deal with violence are very well informed. I'm not sure that I would say that about some of the editorials or the letters to the editor, but they're two different things. So I think the media does a pretty good job of trying to pass on information, whether we're willing to accept it or not. Whether we're really willing to hear it is another question.
I think when you look at the pieces that are out there to give information, if you've been looking at the Times-Dispatch yesterday and today, there are two very good pieces, factual information on cities in Virginia, hitting some of that statistical information, some of the same issues that we've been raising. So that type of information, as opposed to what you were talking about, the editorials not informing, you see the clear difference about the newspaper for information versus a newspaper for opinions that may not be well researched. But that is a good question. Are there more questions? Please don't be hesitant that the mic doesn't bite.
Senator Marsh mentioned earlier that the people need to get involved, the communities need to express their feelings. He also mentioned that we used to consider the problem to be an urban problem, an inner city problem, but now it's spreading out more. I would like to know what you all think about how much influence the wealthy communities have. I want to know what's going to happen when there's a drive-by shooting in Beverly Hills. I mean, is something going to change? How much influence does the wealthy community have in this whole thing?
Senator Marsh.
There's a famous book entitled "It Takes a Village to Raise a Child," and it got a lot of recognition and also got a lot of criticism, but there's an awful lot of truth in that book and in that idea. When I was coming along, the entire community was interested and concerned in all of the children. And it's even more important today with the breakup of the traditional family that the entire community becomes involved in the children of the community. Most of us belong to organizations, and some of these organizations do worthwhile things, but there are opportunities for these organizations to adopt a group, to spend time with a group, to introduce some young people to college, just to see a college campus, to get involved. And my theory is that, in response to the question, that if we're going to solve some of these problems, a lot more people have to get involved. In one of the presidential campaigns, a candidate who I didn't support, George Bush, was debating Jimmy Carter, who I did support. And Bush threw out this expression, we're going to solve this problem with 1,000 points of light. And he went on and on and on. And you know, the idea was good if he meant it, but the charitable community, the private community, they have to do more. It takes all of us to turn this thing around. And people are wondering why the pass rate in the school systems in the inner city is about 40%. There are a lot of problems out there. There are adopt-a-school programs. There are programs where people whose children have gone can volunteer time. We need to get involved in the community because it's our community, and if we don't get involved in it, it's not going to make it. So to answer your question is, all of us have a responsibility. Someone mentioned what happened about the young people packing guns. The reason why I started this group called Blacks Mobilized Against Crime, I went to a school in the middle school in the East End, and I sent all the teachers and counselors out of the room and out of the auditorium and started talking to the young people. And a lot of the young people in the middle school said they regularly packed a piece. These are middle school kids. And I said, why? Self-defense, the same thing. A middle school in the East End. Kids carrying a piece. This was years ago. And I said, well, you know, we got to get citizens involved. So Walter Kenny and I tried to start this group called Blacks Mobilized Against Crime. We wanted black citizens who had time, leisure time, to get in the community and get in these schools and work with these kids. And it got bogged down because of the liability problems. The city didn't want to expose people to these children unless they'd been trained, and they were concerned about something happening to somebody. And by the time we took these people to class on Saturdays, by the time people went through all the red tape, they lost interest. But it was the idea, somehow or another we got to find a way to make it work.
Thank you, Senator. There was a story on the TV last week about an individual who had gone into the Hillside community. It started with the kids with weight training, I believe, a way of sort of channeling that pubescent or prepubescent energy and need for a father figure into something positive. So that was one person's idea of a solution toward redirecting the lives of these young people. And I thought that was very commendable that this individual went outside of his community. He went outside of his comfort zone to go in and to try to reach out to children that are very much in need and very much in an at-risk environment. So I think you're absolutely right. Going in and saying, we care about you is very important. Other responses to that particular question?
The wealthy communities being built in metropolitan Richmond today are being built by separating them out in their tax base from the poor communities. The tax rate in Henrico County is 60% that of the tax rate in Richmond, and the tax rate in Hanover County is 50% that of the tax rate in Richmond, and the tax rate in Chesterfield County has just been reduced last week. By separating these counties out from the city of Richmond, the profits and the incomes of wealthier citizens are enhanced, and the ability of places like Richmond to deal with its issues, which we have been left with, are decreased. So it is very much more difficult. For example, we have an Elkhart Middle School. I was talking to a teacher the other day, highly impacted middle school. A teacher's in a classroom with 30 eighth graders from low-income environments, many of whom are under high stress. A single teacher in a classroom with 30 eighth graders in that kind of situation, that's an exercise in major crowd control, and certainly not an opportunity for working constructively with people. But we simply don't have the resources. As this country has gotten richer, the trickle down has stopped. And that's what's going on right now. Wealthy communities really have a responsibility in this country, and somebody has to tell them not just to act personally, but to reaffirm our major commitment to making the economy work for everybody. That really has to happen, and somebody needs to say it as loudly and clearly as possible. I love the personal efforts, but I think we also need the structural efforts.
Ben, I know you've written about this before in some of your columns in the Times-Dispatch, and one of the points that you've made in the past is that the needs are great in an urban environment like Richmond, but the services that are provided in Richmond for all the region. And we also have not only the problem of the impaction of our own population, but we have almost the mandate to provide the services, but without state and federal resources as well, which also straps the locality and divide the very rich from the very poor, with a lot of the resources going definitely to the suburban areas as far as economic resources.
Yeah, I wanted to echo that also and say that all you have to do is to look at the traffic patterns in rush hour, both in the morning and the afternoon. And in the morning, people are headed from all over the counties into the city. In the afternoon, they evacuate. And when I first moved to Richmond, I came from another city and was sort of shocked that Richmond did not have a city wage tax, because that has been the answer to some other cities in terms of the suburbanites coming in and using services and being there with police and fire protection during the day, and then leaving at night comfortable and not having to help pay for any of that service that they use on a frequent basis. So while it's not a very popular idea, I think that maybe there ought to be some consideration given to that too.
We have time for maybe one more question or two. I know Senator Marsh and I do have an 8:30 engagement. Yes.
Reverend Carver, I'm from Richmond, 51 years. A comment my 13-year-old daughter made to me the other day: "Daddy, you were right. We don't need cable. It's too violent." I held out a long time, and we don't have all that gory stuff, but we just have regular TV, just HBO. And she and my wife, we are deciding to get rid of that. I worked with juveniles back in the 70s, 72, 75. I did a diagnostic center. And if I could go back and find some of the documents that I wrote, I'm saying that if we don't deal with the young people now by listening to them, this was in 75, 70, 72, 75, then we're going to have a problem. I don't know when the last time anyone went past the reception and diagnostic center to see all of the barbed wire. We didn't have that when I was out there. We could talk with the young people. But my question is that I think capitalism has a lot to do with a lot of what is going on in the city. Everybody's about their mighty dollar. And to attack the media, to attack the journalists, to attack people who are our leaders, I think we are missing the common sense approach of this. By listening and looking and seeing what's happening out here, we have to make a law just across the street. I heard on the TV, I heard on Channel 8 the news today, that Jerry Springer out in California, they are making a law, a city ordinance, to ban children from watching the show because they're taking the violence in the school. I teach over at Armstrong High School. The violence is there, but I'm not threatened because I tell the kids I don't have a gun, don't need a gun, but if I'm going to be a statistic, then that will happen. But I'm not afraid to go anywhere in my city. But my question is basically, when are we going to get to the common sense approach in saying that when you see it on television, someone putting a gun at someone's head, just shooting and shooting and shooting, and all of these kinds of things that we are making money off, when are we going to get to the common sense of this?
Senator Marsh, you did mention the profit motive.
Soon, I hope.
Thank you. I guess I'm to turn it over to David Burhans now. It sounds like a good person to turn it over to.